Okay, welcome everybody to our weekly Sunday afternoon broadcast, where we bring you voices that we think can make a significant contribution to the discussion on delivering effective solidarity to the beleaguered people of Palestine. My name's Mick Napier, and I'm the weekly interviewer on behalf of the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. Delighted this week to have Ramzy Baroud to discuss with us current affairs, his forthcoming book, possibly, and his recent book, The Last Earth, to which he spoke in a Scottish tour some months ago. Ramzy, a big welcome to you from Seattle. So I should say to you, good morning.
Good morning and good evening to you, Mick. How are you?
Yes, very well, thank you. It's great to have you, Ramzy. Ramzy, you're a Palestinian American. So that gives you a very privileged, valuable insight into the torture and the savagery and the resistance in Palestine from the heart of the beast. I said to you just before we came on, we would love to have a more vigorous rebuttal here in the UK of the absurd, incessant allegations of anti-Semitism against all square for Palestinian freedom. Can you tell us what sort of transformation have you seen in the USA? Are there any grounds for optimism, Ramzy?
Well, I think optimism is always present in the sense that as long as there is a single woman or a man fighting for their rights, there is always a source of optimism. The situation here in the US might be more grim, generally speaking, than the situation in Britain, in the sense that debate is quite muffled on Israel. We don't hear a great deal of meaningful discussion on the things that truly matters in Palestine and Israel. What we hear rather is this constant distraction determined and created by the Zionist lobby in this country. And they are very good at it. Whenever we find a point where there is enough critical mass of understanding and awareness and people are ready to engage in the issues that matters, the Zionist lobby comes with more accusations of anti-Semitism against anyone who dares to speak for Palestinian rights, defend Palestinians, or at least speak of a just and a peaceful solution for both sides. Any interpretation, any political or media interpretation of the situation in Palestine that does not see eye to eye with the Zionist lobby here is considered a form of anti-Semitism. And that kind of creates a dilemma for so many people. In fact, this is the very issue that I have raised when I came to speak in Scotland last year, that this is a battle that can't be won if you are going to play it according to the rules of the Zionist lobby. If you are going to engage them in trying to sanctify yourself and to prove to them and to the others that you are not anti-Semitic, you can't possibly do so, because the fact that you even recognize that there is a Palestinian people with rights, who deserve their right of return, who deserve their freedom, who deserve their justice, then in one way or the other, you are engaging in a form of anti-Semitism. So you can't win this battle based on their own terms. And I think this is as true here in the United States as it is in Britain.
Because there's nothing unique in domestic supporters of an anti-colonial struggle being repressed. I'm a little bit older than you, Ramzy, or considerably older, and I remember the campaign in the USA against the war in Vietnam, where there was repression, the free speech movement at Berkeley. But the response to that repression, the resistance to that repression, raised the campaign against that particular genocide. There are parallels with with effective solidarity with the Palestinian people today.
Oh, absolutely. I think when we find ourselves in this kind of situation where we are being cornered in a sense, I think that brings the best in us as well, because it allows us to kind of look back at ourselves and our movement and to think truly of who we are and what we want. And I think that common understanding, it creates or shapes and molds movements in the long run. There's absolutely no question that we have no room for racism in our movement, not just anti-Jewish racism, any racism of any kind, because any racism in a movement like ours not only derails the movement, but denies its very, the very core of that movement as well. What is the point if you are standing for Palestinian rights? While you are doing it, you are racist against this group or this other group. Even the Palestinians themselves wouldn't accept it, regardless of how the Zionist lobby feels or does not feel about the issue. But that in mind, we have to understand that the Israeli and the Zionist tactic is constantly aimed at not just distracting us from the struggle at hand, but to breaking down our movement from within. And to a certain degree, they have succeeded in some communities because it allowed many people, and I think you are struggling with this in Britain as well. Jeremy Corbyn, I believe, before he became the head of the Labour Party, I feel like his discourse on Palestine was far more defined and accentuated and stronger than what it is today. When he was placed in this position, he was basically found himself cornered with all of these anti-Semitic accusations, and the Labour Party is kind of, in some sad way, is kind of eating itself from within. So we have to be savvy. We have to be better than this. We have to be stronger and smarter than this. We have no room for racism in our movement, regardless of anything else. But on the other hand, we need to keep the focus on Palestine, on Palestinian rights, on Palestinian people who are struggling in Gaza, in the West Bank, and everywhere else, as opposed to allow for this distraction to carry on.
But in the USA, we've seen Black Lives Matter, various very high profile iconic figures in the struggle for Black liberation domestically in the USA, taking the Palestine issue to heart in a way that hasn't always happened here. I just saw a Gallup poll result from a couple of months ago, Ramzy, and it said that the majority of American youth much more sympathize with Palestine than with Israel. Given the way the public discourse is managed, isn't this quite astonishing? Isn't this a tribute to Palestinian resistance?
Oh, absolutely. And I think we need to give ourselves a little bit of credit as well in the process, because we are faced, our discourse, our narrative is faced with numerous obstacles from government, from media, from many circles that tries to create barriers between the authenticity of our narrative and the American people. And yet the fact that we managed to penetrate most of these obstacles and still get to large sections of American society, I think it's absolutely incredible. And I think of course, most of the credit goes to the resisting and defiant Palestinians at home who are relentlessly fighting for their rights, and the righteousness of their struggle is far more valuable and far more effective than all the Zionists and corporate media propaganda in this country. But on the other hand, I think that there are so many communities and groups in this country that are working day and night. You mentioned the African-American solidarity here. I think perhaps the African-American solidarity with Palestine and Palestinian solidarity with African-American causes in this country is perhaps the most successful form of intersectionality that this country has witnessed since the civil rights movement. And it is, and we are barely just building the foundation of that movement. Recently, I was in Atlanta, Georgia, and I spoke in many of the places that served as platforms for civil rights movements in the United States. And it was absolutely incredible seeing how the churches, especially Black churches, are now internalizing and understanding the Palestinian narrative. The lack of defensiveness that I've experienced there, it's astounding and very, very encouraging. But again, we are barely building the foundation for this to become a movement that in fact achieves its critical mass, we have to work much harder and we have to expand the circle as much as possible.
I agree completely, but is Donald Trump's full spectrum barbarism, hostility, brutal hostility to Palestine, but also endless dog whistles of anti-black racism, Mexicans and so on, is he making it a little bit easier to meld or to build those coalitions?
Much easier in some strange way, although we kind of say this, we rarely kind of reveal this publicly, but in some strange, very, very, very odd way, Donald Trump maybe was one of the best things that actually happened to our movement.
But isn't it better to have a very stupid and ugly enemy who's brutal and crude rather than a smooth talker like Obama, who leaves office with a 32 billion gift to the apartheid state?
Exactly. So we're not really sacrificing anything in the process of acknowledging that, because at the end of the day, Barack Obama almost completely demolished the anti-war movement in this country. He painted himself as a progressive when he is the farthest away from being progressive. He has killed more innocent people using drones than George W. Bush has, and he deported more undocumented immigrants to this country than any other president in the past. Yet you speak to many Americans who are, kind of look back at the days of Barack Obama with a great deal of nostalgia. While Trump, on the other hand, is allowing us to expose this charade that is happening within the ruling political elites in this country. And a lot of people are becoming sympathetic with Palestine simply because of his anti-Palestinian discourse that has reigned supreme for the last 2 years. And that is giving us a lot of margins, a lot of openings in this, where we are able to engage people at a whole different level, especially within the Democratic Party and especially young people.
Do you mean if Trump attacks the Palestinian people? It's a small country far away, there's a lot of barbarism in the world as a whole. But you mean if Trump attacks the Palestinian people, singles them out, they have to be the good guys for a huge tranche of American society, yeah?
That's right. That's exactly what it is. And I think this is a golden opportunity for us to really go out there and engage, because it's so important that as intellectuals, as organizers and mobilizers, that we do not become confined within the little spaces and the little platforms that we've had and, kind of preaching to the choir type of thing. This is time that we go out there. And I think intersectionality is a massive opportunity for us because it allows us to delve to a whole new platforms that have already been mobilized and organized by others. And we come and we present our case to them the same way they come take advantage of our platforms as well. So when I see Palestinians active in the Black Lives Matter movement, when I see Palestinians active in the struggle against the mistreatment of our brothers and sisters and comrades coming from South America, it gives me a great deal of hope that not only we are expecting world sympathy, we are ready to give it as well. And that, I think, at the end of the day, makes all the difference.
Mazen, you talk about intersection, building alliances against the, not a scientific term, but the beast, yeah? The many-headed beast. I try and bring into focus some fantastic, good positivity. You're based in Seattle. I want to go a little bit north of there into Canada. But before the good news, good news focus, in terms of intersectionality, we have the horrific situation in Scotland that an anti-racist march takes place every year, and the organizers do not prevent Israeli flags and a presence by a group that openly supports every Israeli crime. Do you have a message to anti-racists here in Scotland, Ramzy?
Absolutely. I think we have to understand what Israel's tactic is at a global scale. Recently, I just came back from Kenya, and I will be going back to South Africa in a couple of months. And one trend that we have noticed that the Israelis are doing in Africa is that they are trying to create these false paradigms. And they are trying to penetrate these societies at every possible level, including grassroots levels, in which they are trying to present themselves as indigenous people, or people who are struggling against terrorism, as people who are fighting the same kind of wars and struggles that other African nations are struggling. Now, the odd thing about all of this is that it was African countries that were the first to propose equating Zionism with racism, and to see this full swing to the point that Israel is now gaining massive grounds in Africa is very troubling and very disturbing, and we have to counter it. Now, how is that related to Scotland? It's the exact same method. There's so much solidarity coming from Scotland for us Palestinians. It is something that I absolutely find refreshing when I go to Ireland and Scotland in particular. To a certain degree, sometimes you feel like you're at home. You don't need to defend yourself. You don't need to justify yourself and who you are and why you struggle the way you do. Unlike the way I would feel like, for example, speaking in other polities in North America or elsewhere. We can't lose this. We are counting on you to safeguard that platform for us. If you allow the Zionists to get a little bit of space here and there, eventually they are gonna be at the center of your every part of your political life. And eventually we are gonna find ourselves being pushed out. So please be very careful. Solidarity means real commitment to the issues that you are fighting for. There is no halfway solidarity, there's no half-hearted solidarity. It's either you stand with me in complete beliefs in my struggle and in my rights, or you don't. So there's no middle ground here. And I really hope that there is enough, and I'm sure that there is enough political consciousness in Scotland that they would block any attempt at pushing us out of our natural place of solidarity, and that is Scotland.
Yeah. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, every single strand of solidarity that we build, where we link, where we, tie together the struggle for Palestinian freedom with racism, anti-Black racism, anti-refugee horror here as well. The world is joined up. If to the extent that Black people in North America embrace and take the struggle for Palestinian freedom, Africans hear about it. Ramzy, you're living in Seattle, or you're based in Seattle from time to time between tours. I've been week that the Canadian Parliament virtually criminalized BDS. Dockers in Vancouver turned away an Israeli ship. And I also remember in Oakland, there was a huge community picket there, which turned away an Israeli ship as well. What's the state of that kind of grassroots support? The Black churches are obviously important in terms of, even if it's no more than shaming the liberals. But what about trade unions and popular community work as is taking place in Oakland? Can you comment on that?
So I go to Canada quite often to speak. And every time I return, I find the movement stronger and stronger and more diverse than ever. But on the other hand, you have this this elitist approach to politics that is led by kind of the Obama of Canada, Trudeau, and others, who are still presenting themselves as progressives and all of that, even though these are, these nonsensical gestures of progressiveness that we kind of see on social media. And sadly, a lot of our own people kind of fall into the trap of thinking that Trudeau is different. While if you actually look at the track record, he is by no means, nor his government and party are different. There's support of the savage war on Yemen, for example. There's support of various dictatorships in the Middle East and other parts of the world. And of course, even BDS, and the odd thing about this particular attack on BDS is that BDS is a non-violent form of civil society resistance. And I emphasize the non-violent not because of any subtle condemnation of violent resistance. I think people have the right to resist by any means necessary to achieve their freedom and their rights. But for a long time, we have been derided as Palestinians, especially in North America, that why can't you be like Martin Luther King? Why can't you be like these civil rights movements that have used, and of course we know that the civil rights movements have used boycott as a very effective tactic against the establishment in this country. Yet here we finally come and say, okay, this is a massive platform of non-violent resistance and non-violent mobilization that is very much consistent with your own history, the very history that you commemorate and you celebrate and you embrace. Yet here, once more, we find ourselves being criminalized and marginalized and divided once more for one thing or the other, which means no form of resistance, no form of dissent is acceptable when it comes to Israel. So I think we have to be more and more aware of this issue and realize that no matter what we do, we will never live up to whatever standards and expectations they have from us. What we need to focus on instead is to widen our circle of support in Canada, in the United States. We need to work with unions, we need to work with marginalized groups, we need to work with various minorities that are struggling and having extremely difficult time as a result of pressure coming from the very establishment that is putting pressure on the Palestinians and their cause.
Does that fit into the view, which not just I, but many of us have held for a very long time, Ramzy, that given the state of public opinion, not public discourse, in terms of deep hostility and suspicion about the state of Israel, but given also the very determined support from corporate Britain, corporate Canada for Israel, that what we're really talking about have a framework, an accurate perception that this is a horizontal struggle. The people at the top are with Israel, and many, many, many of the people at the bottom tend to support us. But a lot of people lose sight of that, and they chase after a will-o'-the-wisp of elite support when it simply isn't there yet.
Right. You cut off a little bit, Mick. If you could kindly just repeat that briefly.
Sorry, it's a little bit intermittent today. We haven't had this before, Ramzy. Given the state of, in the light of what you said, does that fits in, I think, the picture that elite support in most countries in the West is for Israel, corporate, political, and so on, or silence. Whereas the state of public opinion, not public discourse, is very hostile towards the state of Israel. Therefore, the terrain that we work on, I think, aligns to seek support, not in the chambers of commerce, but among trade unions, not in the elite, but among the grassroots. Does that
absolutely? And I agree with you 100% in this. And you know, there are two things I'd like to say about this. Number one is that this has always been the case in the support of any anti-liberation or of any liberation struggle anywhere, any anti-colonial struggle anywhere in the world. It's always been this way. First, you achieve support among ordinary people, and then the elites kind of follow suit. An example would be, see what happened in South Africa when Nelson Mandela was designated as a terrorist by the US government and the US Congress, and when he was celebrated as a hero in the rest of the world. When Nelson Mandela was released, I believe it was 92, and became a president 94, yeah, it took the Congress years and years to remove him from the terrorism watch list. I think it was 2008 when he was removed from. So if your approach was appealing to the Congress, you would have failed a long time ago. Yeah. Your approach should have always been appealing to the masses and organizing and mobilizing. And I'm not talking, when I say appealing to the masses, I'm not talking about any sentimentalities. I'm talking about strategy. Mm. Because they would have no other option but to follow suit. In our case, as Palestinians, I think we have made a mistake. And this is not the first time I take responsibility for that mistake, but we have made a mistake with Oslo. Not just that Oslo was a very unfair document, and it did indeed sell the rights of the Palestinian people, and it removed our struggle from United Nations resolutions and humanitarian laws. But it also changed our sense of political geography. We began thinking that the Congress and the White House and the British government and so forth are the ones that we need to appeal to in order for us to change the situation in Palestine. And in the process of doing so, we have neglected the massive audiences and strategic depths that we had all over the world, from South America to Africa to various communities and groups and unions throughout Europe and the rest of the world. And this is why I think it wasn't Oslo that I found it to be the greatest challenge to the Palestinian people, but it's that change of perception of how solidarity should be garnered and accumulated. And we need to, and I know that there are so many Palestinian intellectuals and mobilizers and organizers out there who are aware of this, and they are working very hard to bridge the gap once more and to take us back to the communities where we should have always been centered, as we have since the very beginning of this issue.
I seem to remember Edward Said chiding, not only, but chiding Yasser Arafat for going to the USA and addressing Zionist meetings of his most bitter enemies, who would manage a smile, but behind the smile there was absolute savagery, and ignoring the natural constituencies that you're listing, Ramzy. So it was wasting time speaking to his enemies and ignoring his potential and real friends. Does that?
And I think Edward Said would have been extremely sad to see that in some African countries, in some African media, we Palestinians get accused of being terrorists because of how they internalize the Zionist discourse and American media discourse on Palestine. I was asked that question in Kenya, although to be honest with you, the quality of the conversation in Kenya was one of the most advanced and most exciting that I've had since I began my book tour last February, or February of last year rather. But I was asked a question by a young student. She said, how do you respond to people who accuse Palestinians of being terrorists? I don't know if this is something that she felt in her heart and she wanted to kind of find a different way of communicating it, or she was indeed just conveying sentiment that she heard elsewhere. And I responded to her by saying, if we are terrorists, then you have to contend with the fact that your ancestors, your forefathers and mothers, the Mau Mau movement in Kenya that fought against British colonialism and in their thousands are also terrorists. If you acknowledge that, then maybe we can discuss it. If you refuse that designation, then my people and our resistance is not terrorist. And I was very happy to see that there was a massive clap by the audience. It's very, very easy to actually reverse this trajectory that has been infused by Israel and its supporters in the Western media. But the challenge is we need to be aware of the fact that it even exists in the first place so that we can go there and try to undo some of the damage that the Zionists have done.
Absolutely. I mean, before you mentioned the Land and Freedom Army, the Kenyan liberation movement against British colonialism, which had seized the best land in the area and given it to white farmers. Before you mentioned the so-called Mau Mau, which was a British term of contempt for the Land and Freedom Army, and emerges from a period of incredible brutality, rape and murder and so on. It's ironic that Kenyans should actually see Palestinians as terrorists, because the dehumanization of Kenyans in the was every bit as horrendous as that of Palestinians today. It's inevitable, isn't it, that an anti-colonial struggle. I remember, can I just say one thing, because I think it's a wonderful insight. I can't remember the guy's name, but one of the guys who followed the conquistadors into the New World said of the Caribs, we call them cannibals because they defend their communities stoutly. So there's no way to avoid it. You will be dehumanized. Hamas, Hamas, Hamas. One question, Ramzy. The BDS movement is massively influential. It's non-violent at its core. That's non-negotiable. But I think it's also important that just what you've said, we say this very, very clearly. It's not for us in Britain or Canada or anywhere else to tell the Palestinians how to fight. They have a right to any kind of struggle they deem appropriate, but whatever they deem appropriate. But we have to defend that right to resist against our own regimes. Would you comment on that?
Oh, absolutely. I think it's important that BDS does not become some sort of an excuse that would allow us to show solidarity with Palestinians while denying them their right to resist at the same time. This is why I am very careful when I use the term nonviolent resistance, and I only use it in very, very specific context. I don't volunteer the term just like that, because there is always this subtle condemnation of armed resistance in Palestine. I wouldn't dare tell the fighters who are, standing at the fence separating besieged Gaza from apartheid Israel to lay down your weapons. Right now, it would be shame on me and shame on anyone else who would do this. But we have to understand that BDS is not the only strategy that needed to achieve the needed resistance that will end up pushing Israel into relenting and ending its occupation and apartheid. But BDS is specifically constructed to allow people from all over the world to unify around one single idea. One thing that we've always struggled with in the past, before BDS became close to being a mainstream movement as it is today, is that a lot of people felt frustrated that they couldn't do enough. What do we do, Ramzy? What do we do, Mick? I'm sure that you got asked this question numerous times in the past. And the answers were always, educate yourself, reach out to others, that sort of thing, which is, of course, very important. We need this. But BDS allowed us to harness all of these energies in a very focused type of work, where you can actually fight the good fight in some small village in Scotland and still be part of a larger movement that's happening from Johannesburg in South Africa to Ottawa in Canada, and still feel part of a global movement in which your action and the outcomes of these actions can actually be beneficial in a measurable way for the Palestinian people. Yeah. And the other thing about it is the degree of diversity, where we can work at, the academics can engage their fellow academics, you can engage politicians, but the very act of going to a grocery store and looking at the items there and making a conscious decision that I do not want to buy this Israeli product is in itself an act of solidarity, especially if you go to social media and say, this morning, I went to such and such store and I refused to buy an Israeli product, and call on your friends and followers and comrades, do not buy this Israeli product. In fact, better yet, let's organize and tell this grocery store not to stock Israeli products. I mean, you see the very single, such a small, seemingly small event can reverberate and unify a movement and can all be part of a larger global movement. BDS has given us all of this. And this is why it's so extremely important for all of us to be engaged. Nobody has an excuse. Nobody is too busy. Nobody is too consumed or unaware that can justify why he or she cannot be part of that movement.
But it's very important from the Israeli and their allies' point of view that people be made to feel there's nothing they can do, that they're impotent. Whatever you try to do, we're too big, you can't touch us, we've got millions, and so on and so on. One of the great strengths of the BDS movement is that there are victories. That however hard they try, we win. And those wins can be local and modest, but they're still victories. And sometimes they're really huge, like against multinationals and so on. Ramzy, you're not just an author, you're a journalist, but you're also the editor of the Palestine Chronicle. I'm speaking to you from Scotland. The Glasgow University Media Group some years ago published a couple of volumes, Bad News from Israel and More Bad News. Are you familiar with it at all?
Yes, of course, I've heard of it.
Yeah, of course you are. But having a conversation with Greg Philo, one of the sort of the main academic there, he says that when he talks to senior admin managers in the media in Britain, and he says, come on, the cameras are off, you know that's ridiculous what you're saying, you know it's not. Remarkable how often the same words come back to him. The same words. I have a mortgage. So it's not that these people in the media don't know that what they're doing is substandard or even absolutely shocking. They do know. How do we relate to the media? One of your responses is to make our own. But what's your views on media coverage in the USA and Britain of the Palestinian freedom struggle?
Let me qualify my earlier answer, just because of it cut off a little bit. Not only do I know of the book, I also read it and quoted it many times in the past. I'm not at all surprised by it, because as someone who has worked in the media and in alternative media, but also got greatly engaged with mainstream media through many platforms in the past, I can tell you with complete confidence that Philo's conclusion is absolutely true. There's no question about it. And then just to give you a very quick example.
Please give us some stories, because we are never supposed to know these things that you from media experience will be able to share. Share them,
right.
Please, Ramzy.
So I was in a book tour in Australia last May. And I got several interviews with ABC News, which is the kind of largest, news corporation in Australia. And I was grateful enough that they would even engage me in the first place. And I was commenting on the primetime news. I think it was about 8 p.m. And there was this massive screen, and there was all these Palestinian children being shot by the Israeli armies, Israeli snipers at the border, or rather at the fence separating Gaza from Israel. And it was very clear. I mean, the images were shocking and were very clear that there's a disproportionate thing happening here. Snipers shooting and killing little children, and then also shooting at ambulances trying to evacuate the children. There's no question about it. But the show host started asking me these rather harsh questions that I did not expect. I thought the fact that they showed the images, she knows, her audience know what is happening, yet she would ask me things like, what do you say that Israel feels that its national security is being threatened by this? And I'm just puzzled by the fact that you see children, little babies being shot, and you tell me Israel's a national security and all of that. And she asked me, and of course I did, the key is do not lose your temper, always remain on point, no matter how much they try to make you defensive, do not allow them to do so. At the very end, we cut off, we are off the air. She turns to me and she goes, I just want to say, Ramzy, I am completely on your side. Word for word, Mick, I am completely on your side. I just want to tell you that we have to read these questions because we have no other option. Later that evening, I gave a speech at the Australian Parliament, and I met with John Pilger, who was kind enough to come to my talk. And I told him, John, this actually happened this morning. And he said, Ramzy, this is the typical line that I get from everyone. They grill you and they demonize you, and at the end, they whisper in your ears that I am on your side. And I think this is kind of the story of many people in mainstream media. But there's something else that I would like to say, and a little bit of an evolution to my take that we need to create our own media platforms, which I raised in my trip to Scotland as well. That I think that it's not enough for us to own the modes of media production, if I'm to borrow from some Marxist terminologies here. We also need to own the narrative that we present in these media productions. The reason I am saying this is that I see some well-funded and thriving media platforms that are supposed to be alternative media, and they are supposed to be there to negate mainstream media. But because they are so defensive and they are so worried about being accused of this thing or the other, because they are worried about losing funding or becoming scrutinized by mainstream media, they end up slowly kind of not shifting the narrative, but rather becoming so defensive in how they present the pro-Palestine point of view, to the point that at the end of the day, you start makes you wonder, are you truly our friend? Are you truly our comrades? Are you standing in solidarity with us? So I think it's far more valuable to actually own a small, underfunded website where you truly engage people and present your story without apology, than to have these massively and well-funded alternative platforms whether in London or anywhere else, that are so defensive that at the end of the day, you can't even really tell where they stand on the issues. So again, not just the media productions, but the narrative itself. If you don't embrace the narrative and don't apologize for it, then you don't really serve something of great value.
No, an old Palestinian Jew many years ago used a metaphor that lingers with me. And he said, look, if you're going to cut down a big tree, it's better to have a small axe, which is sharp, you'll get there, than a huge axe, which is blunt. It'll just bounce off the tree and it'll injure you. So are like false charts to a sailor. What you've just said then, following on from that, there are some people who argue that we relate to the media. It's good to schmooze with journalists and win their personal confidence and so on. But what you're saying is, although that could be useful in some situations, the problem is not that they don't know. The problem is they can't get it past their editors and sub-editors. So is it a waste of time to do that? It's the main thrust of the strategy towards the mainstream media, Ramzy.
Oh, absolutely. And I've experienced this myself in the early part of my career. It was so focused on getting published in the Washington Post and various other papers here in the United States. And for me, it was a great achievement. And of course, they would have to emasculate your narrative time and again until they get a version that is not as radical as the one that you would have published elsewhere. But still, we thought, you know what, it's getting an article published in the Washington Post once a year is better than having these blogs and all these, kind of alternative small platforms everywhere else. But at the end of the day, I discovered that that was actually quite a big mistake. Mm. With the Palestine Chronicle, we received something about 20,000 readers every single day for the last 20 years. We have influenced the mindsets of a whole generation. If you go to Google Books and write Palestine Chronicle, you will find that literally hundreds and hundreds of books have quoted us and cited our work that does not apologize for anything and says it as it is. Many of the very good journalists today from Al Jazeera to elsewhere began their careers at the Palestine Chronicle. So it's, as you said, is that small sharp axe. You just have to be patient and you have to wait for the outcomes over the long term. But the other important thing is that the fact that we don't work alone, the fact that you are interviewing me and you have the Palestine Chronicle in the background, and the fact that I would be promoting your work and the excellent work of the Scottish Solidarity Movement elsewhere, this is being duplicated everywhere. So our actual strength doesn't come from our numbers per se, but it comes from our unity and the unity of our narrative. And that is what's making change. BDS is not growing because of some article that got published in the Washington Post. BDS is growing because of us. This is the truth. And if we want that growth to continue and to happen, especially at a grassroots level, we need to continue doing what we are doing, as opposed to get distracted and start appealing to this journalist and that. And believe me, no newspaper anywhere, no mainstream corporate newspaper anywhere wants to publish our narrative the way it is. It has to be reduced and emasculated and broken down to give that aura of fake balance and fake objectivity. At the end of the day, it will not have the kind of effect and kind of difference that it should make. So I think that people who compromise on their narrative are people who end up losing in the long run. And people who stick to their guns and to carry on with a strong, even if they may appear radical to readers and people everywhere, at the end of the day, they are the ones who are going to change the world.
Ramzy, your books are largely about Palestinian resistance. Your new book is about resistance inside the Gulag. I don't know the best term to use for these atrocity. Do you think that the current slide of Israel towards tightening its alliances with Bolsonaro, with the Ukrainian regime, which has a neo-Nazi battalion, the Azov battalion, armed by Israel. Do you think the move by Israel towards a tighter link with these regimes is connected to Palestinian resistance and therefore the trouble it has in holding liberal opinion in Western countries? And these regimes are more reliable allies for an ethnic cleansing regime of tremendous brutality. Would you comment on that?
Absolutely. I'm sure that you've noticed that a few days ago, Benjamin Netanyahu tried to prove scientifically through DNA analysis that Palestinians do not belong to Palestine. And what does that remind us of?
Sorry, can you repeat that? I lost you for 2 seconds. What did this guy try to prove through DNA analysis?
So he tried to prove through DNA analysis that Palestinians are not natives to that land, and they don't.
Of course.
Now, what does this remind us of? You know, this kind of scientific proof of racism, you know, that served as the foundation of racism in the 19th and throughout the 20th century. It seems to me that the Zionist discourse is fully embracing the far right. Not it seems to me, I know for a fact, fully embracing the far right type of discourses and the ultra-nationalist discourses that are happening all over the world. And this is why this symbiosis that's happening between Brazil, Modi's India, and Orban and other parts of Europe as well. And I think, are you able to hear me okay?
It's intermittent to a small degree, but I'm getting it, yeah.
So I think you're absolutely right. The fact is Israel is losing its base, its liberal, even at times progressive base that supported Zionism as supposedly, strangely enough, as a progressive socialist idea. That dream is gone. That base is demolished. And now they are desperate, trying to create an alternative base to sustain Zionism, and that base is now being the far right and the ultra-nationalist and racist movements throughout Europe. And it's so very important, I think, for us to expose that link. I don't know why it's not being discussed enough. I wrote about it repeatedly, especially at Al Jazeera, about the far right Israel connection. It is happening unabashedly, brazenly, and it's happening every single day. And that needs to be exposed so that the world understand when we say that Zionism is a racist movement that can only thrive within the context of other racist movements. This is precisely what we are talking about.
Thanks, Ramzy. Ramzy is the author of several key works for people interested in Palestine solidarity and Palestinian freedom. Ramzy, this is a book where Chomsky called it oral history of a very high caliber. And you tried to take the voices of ordinary Palestinians, not the political elite or the best known names, but the people who are the backbone of resistance in any anti-colonial struggle. We'd like to say a few words about this book, please. And I'd like you to tell people why you think they should buy it. I'll certainly tell them, but maybe a few words from you, Ramzy.
Thank you, Mick. First of all, you have to buy it if you like the reviews and on all of this, because for us independent authors, we rely on this, on this kind of support that we receive from you in order for us to carry on with our work. If you buy my books, then the publisher is going to feel encouraged that Palestinian books are selling and they will publish more and more Palestinian authors. And it's so very important that we influence the discourse on Palestine, Israel as much as possible. But why this book specifically? I think it's important for us to acknowledge the fact that the voices of ordinary Palestinian people have either been hijacked or marginalized entirely from the way we tell our story. On one hand, you have this Zionist narrative that have really pushed and marginalized all Palestinians and Palestinian voices entirely. But on the other hand, back to our discussion about Oslo, the Palestinian narrative became so so marginalized by our own making, meaning that we became so focused on talking about the peace process, the two-state solutions, the land for peace formula, the negotiations, all of these kind of terminologies that don't mean anything in everyday reality in Palestine. They don't change anything in terms of the relationship between the Israeli soldier at a checkpoint and a Palestinian trying to get to his hospital or to his work or to visit his family. The reality in Palestine, the language in Palestine, the everyday narrative in Palestine is entirely removed from what we think Palestine is or what Palestine has been reduced to be. So this is a form of what we call people's history or history from below. It's an attempt at reimagining the Palestinian narrative altogether and having the story of Palestine and Palestinian history and Palestinian reality narrated by the Palestinian collective. So it's the outcome of numerous interviews conducted with Palestinians everywhere. And these are stories that we felt represent that Palestinian collective, regardless of faction, of ideology, of religion, of gender, of anything else. I hope that you will appreciate what we try to do in this book. And I would also like to say something about my next book, if you don't mind, Nick.
Go on you go. And I've got some questions from viewers, but please make a punt for this new book because it's very relevant to the conversations we've been having recently. We had Nahla Abdo speak about her book about women prison system. So your stuff follows on from that. That's great. Please go ahead. Yeah.
Absolutely. So the issue of prisoners in particular is the one that has been subject to the greatest act of reductionism, that we only remember prisoners when they are on hunger strikes, and not just on hunger strikes, in a very advanced stage of that hunger strike. Such and such prisoner is about to die because he is on a hunger strike for the last 48 days, and so forth and so on. And we share a few words of solidarity here and there, and we move on once that hunger strike is broken for whatever reason. But I recently, or about a year ago, I spoke with a group of prisoners that freed Palestinian prisoners in Istanbul in Turkey. One was from Fatah, one was from Hamas, one was from the Islamic Jihad. People whose narratives we are told should be entirely different. They are at odds with each other. They are more disunited than you can possibly imagine. I couldn't sense any of that. Factionalism has made any difference in the way they perceive themselves and the relationship with each other. More importantly, they apologize for nothing. These are people who made a choice knowing that that choice is going to end up in their death or their imprisonment. And they made that choice and defended that choice bravely every single day inside Israeli prisons. And they are yet neglected. They are completely dropped out of our narrative on resistance. And they are completely dropped out in the way we present the Palestinians to the rest of the world because we are afraid to take responsibility for them, because we are afraid that they are going to be seen as a liability for us. So what we did is we took advanced our narrative of people's history, and we decided to deal with this issue with all of its challenges and difficulties. Not just that, they are what Antonio Gramsci refers to as the organic intellectuals. These are people who have done more than articulate a discourse, but people who have actually been engaged and are willing to pay their lives in defense of that discourse. They are the true organic intellectuals of Palestine. As a result, I decided I will not write their stories. We will let them write their own stories because they are far more articulate and far more capable of conveying these sentiments on their own. So this book, These Chains Will Be Broken, is the story of 20 Palestinian prisoners from throughout Palestine, in Lebanon, in Jordan, telling us their stories the way they wish to do.
That's very moving. I am a great admirer of and certainly Gramsci, but for a very long time as a youth I didn't understand the word pessimism of the phrase pessimism of the intellect optimism of the will. But an American worker, I think, translated it brilliantly. He said, get your arse into gear and your brain might follow. And I thought that was a really powerful way of getting the same idea. Ramzy, a couple of questions before I ask you to sum up with some final remarks. Somebody's asking, what about the influence of Christian Zionism in the USA on the politicians? That's one question. Secondly, are you going to come back to Scotland? The answer is yes, I'll answer for you. And three, Helen wants to know if you've had the opportunity to visit Cuba as you travel around North America. Three questions. Right.
Of course, I am always ready and, to pack my bags and come back to Scotland. For me, it's great to really feel accepted and embraced by a community. And I always feel that way in Scotland. So thank you for all the work that you do in Scotland. And thank you for giving people like me the space to address your audiences and to engage them in issues that matters to all of us. I would love to go to Cuba. I haven't had the chance just simply because logistically and in terms of the kind of invitations, I usually go where I am invited. And in Cuba, we haven't sorted out that kind of logistics yet, but I would love to finally be in a place that since I was raised as a child, really Cuba was one of those places that for us Palestinians represented a great source of hope. And I also met many Palestinian doctors who graduated from Cuba, who saved many lives in Palestine. So Cuba is not just a place of your everyday solidarity. It's a place that means a great deal for us Palestinians. Of course, Christians.
Sorry, after you. Sorry, I interrupted you. I thought you finished.
No worries. Christian Zionists. I mean, we were talking about how Israel has kind of abandoned its liberal, so-called progressive base in the West. And they are creating new spaces that will serve as that kind of reserve for the Zionist movement for many years to come. The way that they have done this with far-right and sometimes outright fascist movements in Europe and other parts of the world, including Brazil and India, the Zionist movement, the Christian Zionist movement in this country has really been their greatest success story. In fact, I think in some ways, what they are trying to do in Brazil, in Europe, and in India and elsewhere is kind of an attempt at duplicating that success story. There's a massive base that supports Israel in this country, but of course they are supporting them for all the wrong reasons. There's no moral argument here. There's no political argument here. It's just outright religious zealousy and blindness. And it's extremely dangerous. And I think the best way to counter this is for us to make it very clear that I know that for us Palestinians, being Christian or being Muslim is not an issue. That I could go for years living in the West Bank, nobody even knows whether I'm a Christian or a Muslim. But I think in many other parts of the world, it's important that we make it very clear that Palestinian Christians suffer as much as Palestinian Muslims do. And they have been part of our struggle, of our resistance, and the collective suffering of our people as well. So it is important that we also address, I do not believe that we should give up on any community, no matter how hopeless it may seem. And I can assure you, many pro-Palestine activists around the world today many of them started from a Zionist background, from a very religious background. And yet here they are, found a way to turn around and support the Palestinian people. So despite the fact that they are extremely influential in shaping foreign policy, American foreign policy on behalf of Israel, we can't move away from them. We have to engage them. We have to talk to them, and we need to bring our Palestinian Christian intellectuals out there to talk on behalf of their community and the larger Palestinian community.
Ramzy, Facebook's very authoritarian, and sometimes exactly after 60 minutes, they cut us dead. So I do apologize in advance if that happens. Jane asks, and it's the wrong time to ask, but you'll rise to the occasion. What's your view of the Abbas leadership in the West Bank, and how does that impede resistance? But you've only got 30 seconds, so it's a...
Can you repeat that very quickly, Meg?
What's your view of Ramzy? What's your view of Abbas's leadership in the West Bank?
I don't know if you can put the word Abbas and the word leadership in the same sentence, to be entirely honest. I think the real leadership in Palestine is the leadership that is standing right now at the fence separating Gaza from Israel, mobilizing tens of thousands of Palestinians in Gaza. The real leadership, the one that is embracing grassroots mobilization and resistance in the West Bank, the real leadership of Palestine are those who are defending the holy sites in Jerusalem, ordinary people, academics, intellectuals, the leaders of the BDS movement. That is, or these groups are the only ones who deserve to have the title of leadership.
Ramzy Baroud, I want to thank you for joining us today. I hope you enjoyed your breakfast now in Seattle and after having made the time to. It's a real pleasure. It's a real pleasure driving around Scotland with you, and it's a real pleasure having you back. We look forward to your new book. Ramzy Baroud, thank you very much indeed, and we will strive to the limit of our ability to deliver effective solidarity to the people of Palestine. Thank you, Ramzy Baroud.
Thank you, Mick.
Look, folks, here's the book. We've got a really cut price deal with the publishers, and just get in touch. There'll be a link added where you can get your hands on a copy, and we'll broadcast in advance, we'll publicize in advance Ramzy's next book. He talked about the importance of the Christian community and of Palestinians. Absolutely. We had Archbishop Atalahana here speaking in 2014 on a national tour. He took second place to no one as an icon of Palestinian resistance. Mazen Kumsia is another, just a Christian community, but he is a Palestinian Christian, and he's coming here to do a speaking tour in a few weeks' time. Information also will appear on this string when we are finished. Mazen Kumsia speaking, as far as I know, in Glasgow for sure, and in Edinburgh as well, and possibly other locations too. Another couple of announcements. Next Monday, a week tomorrow, the Network of Photographers for Palestine, Active Stills, is bringing a Palestinian photographer to speak and show his work and other work in Edinburgh next Monday night, 8 days' time, 7 o'clock in the famous Augustine Church. And all are welcome to attend there. It will increase your state of knowledge. Edinburgh SPSC branch has a meeting this Saturday in 60 table where they discuss in depth a theme related to Palestinian liberation. Details also will appear on this string after we finish. On Saturday, the 3rd of August, there's a demonstration outside the city chambers in George Square in Glasgow against the Israeli surveillance system, which has been deployed in Glasgow since 2013. The Home Secretary last week said he was authorizing tests, experiments, pilots. Well, this was already deployed in Glasgow 6 years ago. God knows it happened behind people's backs. San Francisco has banned facial recognition for the police to use. Glasgow not only has facial, it has emotional recognition software. An Israeli nightmare imported into Glasgow, and against that. Next week, I'm delighted to have Ran Greenstein from South Africa speaking about his book, Popular Struggle in Palestine, or I'll hold up a copy shortly. But we're delighted to have Ran. And then the week after that, in 2 weeks' time, we'll have Tony Greenstein, who has done some tremendous work in excavating the dark heart of Zionism, and providing people with the information, the ideas, the weapons with which they stand up to these false accusations of anti-Semitism. Tony himself was expelled from the Labour Party on a related issue, but effectively for standing up to false allegations. Friends, thanks for staying with us throughout. We hope you'll like the page. It really helps us. We hope that this is the book next week, Ran Greenstein, Zionism and Its Discontents. It's a focus on left Israel, but it will raise a whole number of related topics. And I should tell you that Lenny Brenner, the author of Zionism in the Age of the Dictators, and this fantastic volume, 51 documents, Lenny's still keen to speak for us, but his techie, Stan Heller, his wife is in hospital as a medical issue, and he's unable to commit to helping us to do that. But as soon as we pull that together, I'll do an midweek interview with Lenny Brenner, and you'll be able to join that to all our great advantage. Friends, Israel shot a Palestinian child of 10 in the head yesterday. Hundreds of items have been found in the kid's brain from the Israeli soldier on a child in Palestine. We ask you to remember that when you join the Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. We are utterly in accord with the ideas espoused by Ramzy. We think it's important to oppose anti-Semitism, but also to stand foursquare, unflinchingly, in support of the Palestinian struggle for freedom, especially when Theresa May and our next Prime Minister, Boris Johnson, will be unflinching in their support for Israeli barbarity. So please join Scottish Palestine Solidarity Campaign. If you're not in Scotland, send us some dosh. We really are running on fumes. We need the money. But above all, we need your active involvement. We need you to join and support and to interact and to be a part of this worldwide movement that Ramzy was talking about. Friends, thank you. We will win. Hard times are coming, but we are going to win in the end.